So we want to talk about flood and predictions in science. Can you really talk about the flood and science in the same sentence? Well, I'll give you my answer to that. Just some definitions with just a little bit of review, a worldview, a comprehensive understanding of life and the universe. What answers our biggest questions? And then a theory supported by some evidence, a hypothesis, is just an idea to be explored. Now, prediction, that's a result that's expected if a given theory or hypothesis is correct. Now, why would we want to make predictions? Scientists are not trying to be...
Forgive me, I've printed the handout in the wrong direction.
Oh, okay.
So they have to...
You start in the middle of your handout. The talk is in reverse order from what it's in your handout. And the handout has been abbreviated some, but all the information is there, just I guess some of the pictures are not there, so it won't be so long. Why do we make predictions? Well, a fulfilled prediction from a hypothesis or a theory gives increased confidence in the theory that it came from. So if we say, now before we do the experiment, we say, if I do this experiment, I should get this result. And we get that result, it gives a lot more confidence in the theory. Just an example, it was predicted that a specific schedule of power and direction would land a spaceship on the moon. Okay, so that's a prediction before we ever went there. And the fulfillment, it landed. And the astronauts were still alive. So we'll talk about some predictions as we address this topic. Study of science in a naturalistic worldview, and we'll compare that to doing this in a biblical worldview. Naturalism is a philosophy, standard model as we could apply it to geology. The naturalistic worldview excludes God. You can have no supernatural, no miracles. Nothing like that can ever have happened if you accept naturalism. In this worldview, in this philosophy of naturalism, research must follow the principle of methodological naturalism. It must follow it. You have no choice, no matter what the evidence, because that's what the philosophy says. Creation or a global flood must never be considered as part of the historical process. By definition, the philosophy does not allow any miracles or anything of the sort. Okay, just talk about the basis of predictions. You're going to make scientific predictions. What's the basis for doing that within the naturalistic worldview? Okay, that worldview starts with these concepts. The radiometric time scale is essentially correct, what we refer to as deep time, millions of years. The geologic record formed over vast amounts of time can be best explained by modern analogs. How do rivers today deposit sand? How do other processes work today? And this philosophy predicts that efforts to explain life or geology on a different basis, like a biblical account, will not succeed. Well, I'm going to challenge that tonight. Now let's switch gears and look at the biblical worldview. Some concepts and a Bible-based acceptance of literal creation week. Life has been on earth only a few thousand years. Basic groups of plants and animals created during a 7-day creation week. Any kind of changes that have occurred, bioevolution that has occurred, was only within each of those groups. Then a global flood catastrophe after creation, and this is a flood, not a local flood. It had to have had significant geological effects. Okay, this philosophy, this biblical philosophy, many will say, well, that won't work. You can't do that. You can't do science that way. Will it work? Here's the way I see one way we begin to define what this biblical philosophy is. It rejects methodological naturalism's restrictions in study of origins. So methodological naturalism doesn't say anything about God. It just doesn't worry about whether God exists, but it says you cannot use idea of God in your scientific explanation. So restriction 1, You cannot ask whether creation occurred. That's by definition, not by evidence. You can't ask that question, because if you ask that question, you've already left the philosophy of naturalism. You've left it behind, and you're looking other places. Restriction 2, you cannot consider the possibility of some events occurring, like a biblical global flood, because the philosophy says there wasn't such a thing. Okay, I think to do science, you must be able to consider all options. If we eliminate some options, some ideas, and say you can't even consider those, you can't ask questions on those, then what have we done? We have made the other point of view dogma. Science doesn't do well with dogma. We must be able to consider all options and at least talk about them and see if they're any good, including a biblical option. Okay, is this defensible? Does biblical thinking introduce a bias? Well, yeah, it does. All science begins from a worldview, and any worldview can bring in a bias. So, the question is, how do you go about this? Predictions are based on the foundation of the worldview. And if naturalism does be brave and make predictions, it puts that worldview on the line for testing. And so if we use a biblical worldview, we do the same thing. It does what science is supposed to do. It puts our theories and our hypotheses out in the open to be explored and tested with science. Now that might sound kind of dangerous. Is this a safe thing to do? Should we be afraid to put this out for testing? Well, keep in mind one thing. We're not testing the Bible. We make predictions from what we read in the Bible, predictions about geology and about paleontology, and we might not get those right, but we keep working, and we're not testing the Bible, we're testing our predictions. In any approach to science, some of your predictions are not going to work out because you just didn't understand. But you keep at it, and if your theory is good, it will make good predictions. And I believe that this philosophy has the potential to produce scientific advances, not just try to sort of manage to keep our beliefs, but it can make scientific advances. The most accurate worldviews or theories will lead to the most scientific advances. So I'm going to predict that our biblical worldview can lead to the most scientific advances if we do it carefully. Okay, so now look at problems with this way of looking at geology and paleontology, and then predictions that we can make. I would see these are probably the biggest problems that we have, that we don't have all the answers for. There's plenty of things we don't have answers for. It'll take thousands of years to find the answers, most likely. So we don't have all the answers, but these are the things that are the most serious problems. Radiometric dating. There's been some research done on it, but I'm not satisfied that we understand how to explain radiometric dates. They're just a puzzle. So that's one of the problems. The sequence of fossils. Why do the fossils look like an evolutionary sequence? That's another one we don't have the answers for. Can geological processes occur rapidly? Many people will say, well, no, they can't. So maybe these are the three biggest ones. So what do we do about them? Okay, here's the problem. We have these ratios of radiometric parent and daughter products. They follow a predictable pattern. And to most people, they would say, well, this indicates millions of years. So here we have the decay curve for these minerals. And we just take one example, potassium-argon method. Potassium decays to argon-40. And as time goes by, then the ratio of those two changes. Down here you have just a little potassium, lots of argon, and it's the opposite up here. Okay, so the ratios change. Now it's the ratios that we measure. There's no instrument you can design that will take a look at a rock sample and give you the age of that rock in years. It just doesn't work that way. What you're measuring are the ratios. The ratios, and those change. And then we get the ratios, and then we use information we have to interpret to decide what those mean. Now, and we don't know what that all means now, but let's look at a prediction. I'll make the prediction that ratios of radiometric parent and daughter products changed for other reasons than passing time. If you had enough time that went by, apparently it would produce those. But since I don't believe that there was very much time, then there must have been some other reason why these changed. And I don't know what that is, but I predict that deep time is not real, at least since the Cambrian. And that's, I mentioned that we don't have the answers, but it isn't as though we don't have anything to look at. There is support for the idea that these dates, what we get as dates, are not really millions of years. There is a lot of geological data that is incompatible with millions of years. So that is a support for that. And we will talk a bit about some of that as we go along. The second problem, sequence of fossil groups seems to indicate large-scale evolution. So you got invertebrates down here, it goes on up, fish and then amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs and birds and mammals start about in here, and finally you get humans at the very top. Why does it like that? Well, we have some interesting ideas about it. The rocks here are mostly marine or maybe along the shore of the marine. So you wouldn't expect monkeys there, would you? So we do have some ways of looking at that to make a little sense of it, but we don't really understand it fully. Prediction. Increasing evidence will show that the fossil sequence was not from large-scale evolution. There's some other process. We've never seen a global flood. We don't know what happens in such an event. And so that's largely one of the reasons why we don't understand this. We've never seen anything like that happen. But there also is support for that prediction. Darwin worried about the lack of fossil intermediates. Well, that's still a problem. If life had developed by evolution, starting from a simple organism, bacterium or whatever it would have been, you should get something like this. You start out with one phylum, say the phylum that includes the bacteria, the microorganisms. And then as change goes on, you should start with small changes which add up to big changes. Finally, you get another phylum, a worms maybe, and then you get another phylum, and then gradually you build up the complexity in the fossil record. Well, the problem for Darwinism is it's just the opposite. This is what you get in the fossil record. This is the Cambrian explosion right here, and basically all the phyla that could be preserved as fossils are there. And you only get smaller changes within those. This here is the theory of the evolution of all these groups. So it's dotted line, it's a theory. Well, a few years ago at the Geological Society of America, I listened to a number of talks on this topic. They had deliberately two groups there, the biologists who study evolution, who study this topic, and paleontologists who know the fossil record. They know what the fossil. The paleontologists are trying to figure out how you could evolve all these phyla so quickly. Because they know there's no fossils below this. Whereas the biologists are saying, no, that evolution won't happen that way. You need another 500 million years down here to evolve all of these, another 500 million years. And there was a topic at noon, a discussion at noon, hot topics at noon. And so they had these two groups, and they were trying to each one trying to make their point. The paleontologists knew there are no fossils, and so how could you have this other 500 million years of evolution? There was one gentleman, I wish I knew who he was. He was in the discussion. He was sitting in front of me, and he stood up, and he said, now, we're being told that there was this 500 million years of evolution, but we know there's no fossils. He said, why are we avoiding the real question? And he sat down. And I'm sure he meant the real question is, did life even evolve? So there is this significant problem that Darwinism has to struggle with. Okay, and there's more. If you're going to evolve all these creatures, you have to have a process to do that. Darwin thought he had a process, mutations and natural selection. To him and his colleagues, life was a little bit of slime in a little packet, and a little bit of jelly in there. Excuse me. And that could easily evolve. Well, we know vastly more than that now. Modern genetics and molecular biology are raising very serious problems for large-scale evolution. By large-scale evolution, I mean evolving all these different phyla and things from one ancestor. Evolving worms and humans from the same ancestor. Some things that current processes show us, genomic analysis finds, for instance, orphan genes. All these different genes we have, if animals had evolved, you should be able to follow the development of any one gene up through the organisms, from early to late, or find out where that gene drops out or where it starts. You should be able to follow it. Well, they're finding there are these genes that just appear here and there haphazardly in different organisms with no trace of where it would have come from. Orphan genes. So that is a big problem for Darwinism. You've probably heard many times that humans are like 98% ape in our genes. Well, there is so much better ways of analyzing genomes now, the genes, that it is now known that that this is no longer true. They're finding more and more difference between humans and apes. And for instance, the Y chromosome in humans is very different, very, very different from a chimp. Much more than you could explain in the time to evolve, even if it is possible to make that change. Junk DNA. There's, it used to be thought that 98% of human DNA is junk, just garbage left over from evolution. That is not true anymore, and I'll say a bit more than that here in a couple of minutes. Natural genetic earring. There's a book, came out I think last year, maybe 2011, by James Shapiro. It's called Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. And he's showing how that evolutionists are not paying attention to what's been discovered by molecular biologists in the last few decades. And he believes that life has evolved, but he also has come to the conclusion that Darwinism doesn't work, and we have no idea what the process is by which evolution worked. Darwin's mutation and natural selection. The cell is so complex that there's no room in there for those random mutations. It just doesn't work. He gets a lot of criticism, but he responds back. He's not afraid. He responds back that the critics, their point of view is philosophical, not scientific. It's not supported by empirical evidence. So there's more and more of this kind of thing as we learn more and more about the cell. Darwinism is in serious trouble. You won't read that in the textbooks or any popular material, because they just will not accept that. But there are people here and there who have the courage to speak up. Okay, a fulfilled prediction. In the 1970s, I was teaching at Loma Linda University at that time, and the molecular biologists in our department were predicting that this junk DNA is not junk. It must be something that is functional and necessary. Okay, 70s, what's that, 40 some years ago? Well, in the last decade or so, there's been increasing evidence that virtually all that junk DNA is not garbage. First of all, they were finding a few genes in that junk DNA that had a function. They were regulatory genes that controlled the other genes. And for instance, the differences between us and the apes are showing up mostly in those regulatory genes, the one that control how the other genes work. They're not junk at all. And then September 2012, the capstone was put on this. The ENCODE project is a huge research project, government funded by some 300 researchers around the world, looking carefully at the human genome. And they found that virtually all junk DNA is actually functional. It's regulatory genes that control the other genes. And they hadn't studied all of them yet, but they said all the ones they studied, the 80%, were functional, so probably all of it is functional. And the term junk DNA has no meaning anymore. That's a blow for evolution, because they need those junk DNA as a source of new genes to evolve. Here's another interesting fulfilled prediction. Spectrum is a magazine published in the United States. It's published by a group of kind of left-wing Seventh-day Adventists, don't really believe the Bible. Gary Gilbert, a physician, he published an article claiming that a certain pseudogene in the human and chimp beta-glomogene family, it has the same mutations in human and in ape in such a way that it says that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Well, even at that time, there were some questions about that, whether it was really true. But in 2012 and 13, new molecular biology research has indicated that that's not a pseudogene at all. It is functional and essential as a regulatory gene. In fact, if you get one mutation in that gene, you'll have abnormalities. So the whole picture changes. Now, Gary Gilbert, based on this argument, he gave up on God and the Bible. What a shame. He should have, as one of my friends said, if he'd have realized the Bible is trustworthy, he should have been able to be the guy who got the Nobel Prize for discovering this. But he didn't. He gave up on God. Another prediction related to evolution. I will predict that there will be increasing evidence that evolution does not go beyond the created genetic potential in any one created group. In other words, God already set up the potential for variation, for adaptation, for speciation, and that's the only evolution that occurs. And so you have these trees, phylogenetic trees, and I will predict that those will collapse as more evidence is found. So let's look at that just a little bit more. Support for the prediction. Now, when you look at how they come up with these phylogenetic trees, it's a process. You take all your data and you put it into a computer, and you analyze it, and it comes up with a tree. Okay, but it can't even attempt to make a tree unless you make the assumption that naturalism is true, that everything has evolved. And the way that's done, if you just put the data for all these animals, all their characteristics, all the computer can do is tell you which ones are most similar to the others, to which others. It wouldn't know how to make it into a tree with the evolution starting here and going up this way. It wouldn't know how to do that. You have to put in an outgroup. So like this is all the mammals. You put in a reptile outgroup, something that comes before the mammals, and you assume the mammals evolved from something like that reptile. And to do that, of course, you have to make the assumption that they all evolved. And unless you make that assumption and put in the outgroup, it cannot make a tree of any kind. So the whole mechanism, the whole process is based on prior acceptance and commitment to naturalistic evolution. Okay, origin of first life. This is where naturalism is in its worst trouble. Molecular biology and biochemistry indicate, we can make that prediction, that without a designer, you will not get new life, get any life from non-life. In fact, the more data you have, the worse it is. And let's just expand on that a bit. No, I went too far. Okay. No, what happened here? Okay, there's no actual evidence to support the origin of life without a designer, the theory of abiogenesis. There is no evidence, but if you accept naturalism, you have to believe that life evolved without a designer. You have no choice, no matter what the evidence. And the more we learn about biochemistry, in fact, the greater the problems for abiogenesis. The problems are more and more serious, and yet the popular books and textbooks will proclaim quite plainly that life did arise without a designer, and yet there is no evidence for that. Okay, another prediction I'll make. Study will indicate that many geologic deposits were formed far more rapidly than usually thought, and that continental drift in the past occurred orders of magnitude faster than is at present. I make that prediction based on the Bible. So I take the Bible plainly and make that prediction that these continents, there's a lot of evidence that they did move, but I will predict that it did not happen over millions of years. It happened really very fast. Okay, another thing that supports the idea of rapid deposition of the rocks are well-preserved fossils. Now, not all fossils are like this. Some of them are a little more messed up, but many fossils are exquisitely preserved. Every bone in place. These are little ammonites and starfish, very beautifully preserved. And there are so many fossil deposits like this. Here's the oldest known fossil bat, just like modern bats, found in the Green River Formation. These are all things in the Green River Formation, insect larvae, delicate insects. Whoops, seems to jump ahead a little bit. Okay, trilobites are not in the Green River, but here's one of these trilobites. What you're seeing right here is the compound eye. Very, very complex, just like creatures that live today, insects and fish. Okay, this one is interesting. I've done some looking at this quite a bit. Okay, don't do that. This is, any guesses what that is? It's a coprolite. Coprolite is fossilized dung. So this is probably crocodile poop. All right. So this is from the Green River Formation, and this apparently was a huge body of water, a lake. And all it's these limestone layers, limestone plus other things, layers, little laminations. And I studied this under a microscope, and you can see the individual laminations. They're about 1/10 of a millimeter thick. And most geologists believe these fine laminations are annual layers, one layer per year. Okay, well, just think about this. This crocodile swam by and he left this there, and so for 180 years, it lay there, beautiful shape, until it was covered. Anybody ready to accept that? Well, I'm not. This had to be buried very, very fast. There's something very wrong with this idea that these are annual layers. This had to be formed, these layers had to be formed very rapidly. And so there are things to be discovered. And the person who's going to discover those are people who are willing to ask the question, did this happen rapidly or over millions of years? If you're not willing to ask that question, you'll never even think about why, okay, what's the problem here? And I see evidence that a lot of scientists really don't even pay attention to what this might mean. Bedded sedimentary deposits. Here are some deposits with beds, layers or beds. We call those bedded deposits. You can clearly see the bedding in here. Many, many layers, rather clearly present. Here's another formation with these beds. When it makes a cliff, you can see them. When it doesn't make a cliff, they get covered. But they're all there. These are limestone, Paleozoic limestone deposits in Utah. And they're not as, it's not easy to see, there's more vegetation, but these are all one layer after another. Many of them. The Grand Canyon, of course, is full of layered beds. Now, when sediment like this gets deposited today in a lake or in the ocean, what happens to them? Well, there are creatures that burrow down through the mud and disrupt these layers. There are plants, if there are plants growing there, the roots go down and mess up the layers. These kind of layers don't get preserved in the modern world. So why are they here? Why weren't there creatures burrowing in there? There are burrows. You can find burrows in these, but not enough to really mess up the layers. Why did they remain so beautifully preserved? This is characteristic of the geological record, these beautifully preserved laminations. Why? Well, if you can explain it if these were all deposited rapidly. It's much more difficult. You have to strain and stress to find some way to explain it if you don't accept that these were buried rapidly. Here are some of the burrows that we do find. This spot happens to have a whole bunch of them. Usually it's like this or even less, either no burrows or just a few, so that you still have these layers preserved. There's not enough action going on by animals or plants to destroy the burrows or even seriously damage them. It's like this. Here's a diagram to illustrate this. If you have, if there are no burrows, it's like this. The layers are still preserved. Over here is the opposite extreme where there's been lots of time and the animals are burrowing up the sediment and just destroying the layers. This is more likely what you'd find in the modern world. And these are intermediates. Well, this is more like what the rock record is like, or maybe sometimes like this. Rapid burial is what it calls for. Okay, some other phenomena. Okay, some other predictions. I will predict that there are many presumed slow geologic processes in rocks were not by those processes. They happened much more rapidly. Some stromatolites or these evaporites believed to have formed over very long periods of time by evaporation of seawater. Well, there are many reasons that we don't have time to go into why that isn't really going to work very well. Those must have been formed very rapidly. And this reef is believed to be a fossilized reef, like a coral reef, although this is not really coral. I'll predict that we'll find, as we study more, that those were formed rapidly, not over thousands of years. Here's one example in particular that is related but a little different. There are some fossil assemblages that resemble what you'd see in the modern world. But I'll predict that those generally were formed by a very different process. And this example is very interesting because in about the 1970s, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church at least, there was some people who were pushing these fossil trees here in Yellowstone as evidence you need long ages of time. These, you go up this hillside, you're going through layer after layer of volcanic sediments, and you have these trees standing upright. So they were arguing, okay, each of these is a forest. One forest died, another forest grew, another forest grew, and so on. It would require very long periods of time. However, careful research, let's see, I think, okay, brief observations seem to indicate they grew where they are. But then careful research was done by a number of people, mostly at Loma Linda University, where you study carefully the sediments and the trees and all that's involved here. You find that, no, the evidence says they did not grow there. They grew somewhere else, and then were all transported in by water, making one layer after another. For instance, the leaves that you find don't match the kind of trees growing there. The pollen doesn't match the kind of trees growing there. Trees don't have roots. There's a lot of reasons for this. And again, here, when this first research was being pushed as a reason why we have to give up the Bible, there are a lot of people who gave up their faith because of that. But the new research says, no, that's not the way it was. Those did not grow there in that position. And come back here again. When Mount St. Helens erupted in Oregon, there was a lake on the side of this mountain, and the volcano blew all the trees down, stripped off their branches, and all the trunks, a lot of them washed into this lake. And so here they are floating in the lake. And one after another, they would rise upright in the water because of just the way the water flows in the trunks, and then they would sink down and sit on the bottom. So it's not really hard to get trees upright if they're being transported by water. In fact, big mud flows carried a a lot of trunks, tree trunks with some roots, down a 60-mile wash, a gully, just a very turbulent, fast-flowing deposit. And then they deposited those trunks sitting upright, right on top of a highway. So it really isn't that hard to get trees upright when they were transported. Okay, here's another idea. A global flood theory will be far better at explaining landforms than the standard model. How do you get cliffs like this? I'm going to try to show you a video in a few minutes, a very short video on this very question. It's hard to find a normal kind of modern process that would erode things like this, where you have a series of cliffs, one after the other. Another one is this long cliff. It's 50 miles long. It's, let's see, it's right here. The people call it 50-mile mountain, and it looks just like this. And we'll look at the next picture that will show why it's hard to explain that. Okay, scientists who follow this biblical approach, I predict, have the potential to be very productive. It opens the way for new discoveries overlooked by other people. And a lot of things are more likely to be discovered in a biblical worldview. Your thinking is opened up by this worldview. I'll give a little simple example. In about early 1990s, I needed a new four-wheel drive vehicle. And so I started reading the reviews on cars, and I discovered one called a Ford Explorer. I hadn't seen any of these on the road, but I checked them out and decided, yeah, that's just right for me. So I bought one. Now, when I drove the roads, I started seeing Explorers all over. Why didn't I see them before? They were there all the time. Well, because of knowing now about Ford Explorers and having one, a little part of my worldview had changed. I now noticed it, whereas before I didn't notice it. And the same thing happens here. And in the second talk, I'll talk more about this. The Bible can open up our thinking to see things that the other people working in a different worldview just don't notice. Okay, this is problems in general with the naturalistic philosophy. If an ancient structure or fossil assemblage resembles a modern analog, the standard model does not motivate deeper study to see if the forest really is like modern forests or if it's different. If your worldview seems to explain it, well, that's fine. We'll go on. And I would say that a lot of people would not like this paragraph, this sentence. Too much dependence on chance, deep time, and naturalistic assumptions shield large areas of origins research from rigorous thought. We are accused of believing, well, God can do anything, so that can explain anything. The naturalists have exactly the same problem. The idea that millions of years and chance can answer anything, explain anything. It's the very same kind of thinking, and it has serious problems. So I'll make another prediction based on evidence and faith. A conservative biblical model will, in the long run, be the most effective model for advancing scientific insights in the history of life and the universe. Okay, I think that's the last one. Well, just one thing is said there, the standard model by many people is considered to be the best model. Well, it only works so well if you start with a commitment to naturalism. If you open your eyes to think of it in other ways, the naturalistic model has more and more problems.